Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching the Today I Found Out YouTube channel, and in the video today we're looking at the origin of spoons, forks and knives. Spoons are one of the oldest eating utensils on the planet. This isn't particularly surprising if one considers that nearly as long as humans have needed food, they've required something to scoop it up with. Unlike knives and forks, which for the most part need to be fashioned, natural spoons could be utilized by employing such things as seashells or conveniently shaped stones. Sure, the earliest instances of these didn't have handles yet, but from these humble beginnings, the spoon was born. There is no definitive time period that can be attributed with the invention of the spoon. And by invention, I of course mean adding some dead animal's bone as a handle. However, archaeological evidence suggests that spoons with handles were used for ancient Egyptian religious purposes as early as 1000 BC. Made from materials such as ivory, wood, flint, and slate, these spoons were covered in ornate decorations and hieroglyphics. When it came to actually consuming food, the most common material at the time for spoons was wood due to the availability and its low cost. However, during the Greek and Roman empires, spoons made of bronze and silver were commonplace among the wealthy. This remained true to and through the Middle Ages. In fact, the first documented evidence of spoons in England was in 1259. It was counted as an itinerary item from King Edward I's wardrobe. Similar to the Egyptians, spoons at this time were not merely used for eating, but also in ornate ceremonies and to demonstrate wealth and power. For example, the coronation of every British king was preceded by a ritual where the new monarch would be anointed by a ceremonial spoon. Spoons were granted even further importance during the Tudor and Stuart periods, when it became customary to give an apostle spoon as a christening gift. The particularly wealthy gave a set of 12 of these spoons, and eventually a 13th was added. This was called the master spoon, as it bore the figure of Christ. This practice gave birth to the tradition of christening spoons, and it was prevalent throughout all societal classes at the time. The only difference was the material from which these spoons were made, typically silver or gold for the upper classes and copper or brass for the lower. The design of the spoon changed throughout the Renaissance and Baroque periods before finally receiving its current, mostly standard look. This happened around the 18th century. Since then, spoons have continued to be a staple of modern tables and come in a wide variety of variations, everything from soup to caviar spoons. Now onto forks. The most recent addition to the Common Cutlery Club is, in fact, the fork. Although they have technically existed since ancient times, these preliminary specimens consisted of a mere 2 prongs and were used primarily for cooking and serving food. Fingers, spoons, and knives were still the most popular choices when it came to actual eating. Some of the earliest known table forks made their debut in ancient Egypt. The Qijia culture from 2400 BC to 1900 BC that resided in part of present-day China are also known to have used forks. A couple of thousand years later, the fork's popularity in the Western world spread via the Silk Road into Venice. One of the earliest recorded evidence of forks in Venice is from an 11th century story of the wedding of a Byzantine princess, Theodora Anne Docania, to Domenico Salvo. She supposedly brought gold forks as part of her dowry. Funny enough, this was quite the scandal. The God-fearing Venetians saw these pronged monstrosities as a slight against the Lord himself, who gave us perfectly good fingers to eat with. To quote St. Peter Damian, "God in his wisdom has provided man with natural forks, his fingers. Therefore it is an insult to him to substitute artificial metallic forks for them when eating." Of course, in the Book of Samuel, which is thought to have been composed around 640 to 540 BC, it states that the Jewish priest's assistants used forks. To wit, "And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came, while the flesh was in seething, with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand." Such trivial mentions as usage in the Holy Scriptures by none other than the priest's servants themselves didn't stop many religious elite of the age from vilifying the fork and poor Theodora. They also didn't like that she used napkins, among other things. When the princess died 2 years later of a mysterious degenerative disease, it was considered by some to be punishment for her pride and perceived excesses. Despite being mentioned as okay to use in the Hebrew Bible, forks in the Western world continued to carry this negative stigma due to their association with Eastern decadence and being perceived as an affront to God. They were subsequently strictly reserved for sticky food. The fork's popularity began to grow in the 16th century due to the infamous historical trendsetter Catherine de' Medici. She helped popularize the fork in France after her marriage to King Henry II. At this time, anything Italian was in vogue thanks to the Renaissance. The fork also became more popular as hygiene ideals began to change. Up until this point, purposefully clogging one's paws with dirt to prevent the plague infiltrating through them was considered a good idea by some. Similar thought processes were largely why some of this age avoided bathing whenever possible. You don't want disease-filled water getting in your paws, after all. Many people also preferred to blow their noses directly into their hands instead of onto the tablecloth, as that would be bad manners. Now imagine these same people eating with their hands. Naturally, the fork began to seem increasingly attractive to those who preferred their food to be free of filth. However, many men still rejected them as they were considered too feminine. This began to alter when they began to be crafted with ruffled cuffs. This might seem strange to us, but let's not forget that high heels were originally invented for men, who also commonly wore tights and what we'd generally consider today as clothing akin to a dress. Now, by the 18th century, curved forks with tines were increasingly used in order to help the fork be used not only as a stabbing item, but also for scooping some liquid items. People would also carry around their own personal cutlery sets, though forks were still primarily used by the upper classes. It wasn't until 100 years later, during the industrialization period, that the lower and middle classes began commonly using forks also. Forks quickly surpassed knives as the most popular cutlery item, which resulted in the Victorians creating an overabundance of fork varietals. Since then, the fork has remained a staple in Western society. As for knives, they have dually been utilized as both a weapon and an eating implement since prehistoric times. This is quite logical. You kill your food and then cut it into conveniently sized pieces with one handy tool. However, knives weren't domesticated or fashioned exclusively for table use until the Bourbon dynasty in France. Up until this point, they were generally incredibly sharp due to their use in killing one's food. As such, the presence of knives at a table posed a constant threat. It's important to remember that this was also an age where a significant source of hydration came from wine and ale. Thus, it wasn't that uncommon for the particularly inebriated to accidentally puncture their mouths while trying to eat their food. Of course, when forks began gaining in popularity in the Middle Ages, this resulted in less of a need for a pointed knife during mealtimes. As such, in 1669, Louis XIV, the same trendsetter who loved doing up his hair and wearing tights, made these overly sharp knives illegal at the table and replaced them with blunter and wider ones. This has, for the most part, remained the norm up to the present day, though the standardized stainless steel variety wasn't introduced until around the 20th century. Bonus fact: ancient spoons in China also sometimes featured a pointy end to be used as a one-prong fork and knife, perhaps the first known instance of the spork or spknife, depending on how you want to look at it. And now for another bonus fact. King Louis XIV may have dressed fabulously, but one Russian ambassador once stated, "His Majesty Louis XIV stunk like a wild animal." Like some of his time in that part of Europe, Louis almost never bathed. In Louis's case, his physicians advised him to abstain from bathing to maintain proper health. Louis himself said he found the act of bathing disturbing. Queen Isabel I of Spain also once claimed she only bathed twice in her whole life, when she was born and when she was married. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, over there on the right, a couple of other videos that you might enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching.